Today, as a rule, we take notice only of the undesirable Negroes and ignore those who are struggling to climb upward. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History finds by scientific investigation that the record of the Negro is not to be despised. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom.
By creating an arsenal of scholarship to combat the lie that African Americans had no history, Carter Godwin Woodson, known as the father of Black History Month, would begin to break the barriers of prejudice that would enlighten generations to come. Woodson was born in 1875 in New Canton, Virginia, the fifth of James and Anna Liza Woodson's 9 children. As the son of former slaves, Woodson grew up extremely poor, working on his family's farm and attending school only a few months out of the year. In 1892, Woodson joined the large migration of African Americans to West Virginia to work in the coal mines. There he met Oliver Jones, an intellectually curious Civil War veteran who operated a tea room for black miners. Since Woodson was literate, Jones urged him to read a wide variety of publications allowed in the shop in exchange for food. Having engaged in discussions about the history of the race, Woodson claimed it was one of the most enlightening experiences of his life. In 1895, Woodson enrolled in Douglas High School in Huntington, West Virginia, completing his studies within a year. Woodson would go on to earn a doctorate from Harvard in 1912, in addition to his degrees from Berea College and the University of Chicago. He remains the first and only person born to former slaves to obtain a PhD in the field of history. Woodson traveled to Africa, Asia, and Europe, teaching in the Philippines and studying at the Sorbonne. Having been taught throughout his schooling that African Americans had no history, Woodson would devote his life to challenging the narrative. His exhaustive research would lay the foundation for African American studies to this day.
His writings are meticulous. He believed in scientific research at a time when many historians were not using it. Much of the fault we find in distorting Black history came from professors who taught history. They had an agenda, and often it was entirely wrong.
Woodson published almost 20 books over his lifetime, covering a broad range of topics in African American history. But he knew that to legitimize the contributions of African Americans, he would need to reach beyond the scholars. In September 1915, at the Wabash YMCA in Chicago, Woodson created the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Now known as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH, the organization would become an outlet to educate the world about Black history.
This society publishes magazines, researches in Negro history, directs studies in clubs and schools, promotes the home study of the Negro by mail, produces texts on the Negro for schools and colleges, collects and preserves the valuable documents of Negro history, supplies libraries with special collections of rare books on the Negro, and educates promising and enterprising young men for service in historical research.
Woodson also established the Journal of Negro History, a scholarly journal where black and white intellectuals could publish their studies. The journal also provided a medium to publish little-known primary documents on African American history. It must be noted that Woodson sought to launch a movement to legitimize African American history during an era of overt racism and mob violence. Yet Woodson believed that education was the catalyst needed to bring about social change and destroy the racist beliefs.
So what Dr. Woodson did was he was debunking the lies about us. So they were literally proving our humanity when he was building up these resources and documenting the truth about our history, and he was talking to real people who had done the work.
There's only one history, and all ethnic groups, all races should have chapters within that history. Few people thought like that before Woodson. He wasn't seeking any kind of superiority. He just wanted people to be equal. And once you know about each other, you're not holding their differences against them. You are respecting them more. To me, that's groundbreaking.
Woodson briefly returned to academia in 1919, serving as a dean at both Howard University and West Virginia Collegiate Institute. However, Woodson, who was deemed radical for insisting on textbook revisions to incorporate African American history, often clashed with administrators and other scholars. By 1922, he would return from West Virginia to Washington, D.C., and devote himself full-time to conducting research and publishing prolifically. That same year, Woodson purchased a home that would serve as his residence and headquarters of the association for the rest of his life. Here he would create his own publishing house, Associated Publishers, to print material on African American history ignored by others and generate an income for himself. The climate of the 1920s brought new interest in Black history. Movements in that decade, such as the Harlem Renaissance, created a heightened sense of racial consciousness among African Americans. Woodson was educating people of their heritage, one of which they could be proud. His home office became a community focal point in the Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Black intellectuals, activists, writers, and artists flocked to his home in support of the movement. There, Woodson also trained a new generation of scholars. While his protégés had immense respect for his passion and selfless dedication to the cause, Woodson's exacting personality often made him difficult to work with. He expected others to work as hard as he did, and would clash with those who did not share his vision.
And Woodson, he could be very blunt. He could be very direct and and very opinionated in many ways. And so African American and white audiences alike didn't always appreciate that. But that was Woodson.
And he was a perfectionist. Everything that went out of that office had to be perfect. And once we were typing, and we had typed about 300 letters, and he found out that one word was hyphenated wrong. We had to do those 300 letters all over.
By the 1930s, Woodson would become more publicly outspoken. In 1933, he published his seminal work, The Miseducation of the Negro, a scathing critique of systemic racism in education and of blacks who would not challenge it. The book would become a manifesto for generations of African American activists advocating radical social change. Woodson expanded his public presence by giving speeches and writing articles and columns in newspapers. He engaged teachers, clergymen, fraternal groups, and black civic leaders to reach the masses. Committed to teaching people at all levels of education, he created the Negro History Bulletin in 1937. The bulletin told the stories of the near great and was aimed primarily for the general black community. For Woodson, history belonged to everyone, and it was too important to be left to the scholars. He would create Negro History Week to ensure that the rich history of African Americans would be taught worldwide. The week-long celebration during the second week in February, in honor of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, would later evolve to Black History Month. It remains today as one of Woodson's most lasting legacies.
In our own country, we find that the Negro, in spite of his enslavement, achieved likewise. Negroes felled the trees, drained the swamps, cultivated the soil, produced the staples upon which the wealth of our Southland has been based. We shall overcome.
Woodson died in 1950 on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement. His pioneering efforts to preserve and publicize the historical heritage of Black Americans would prove essential in the struggle for equality. By institutionalizing the study of African American history, Carter G. Woodson would begin to break down the barriers of racial prejudice and hate and transform minds to this day.
He gave us a truer understanding of the United States by showing us that African Americans contributed mightily to this nation. But all this has happened because he brought truth to light.
Let the knowing speak. Let the knowing speak. Let those who were oppressed speak of their